Richard M. Nixon campaigned as a conservative in 1968, but after taking office in 1969, he supported a number of domestic policies that were near and dear to liberals. He would try not to promise or spend as much as Lyndon Johnson, but as he put it, he wanted to be an activist president in domestic policy. Nixon told his cabinet, "Don't promise more than we can do, but do more than we can promise." The Clean Air Act of 1970 was the most sweeping measure of its kind ever written, and as its provisions started to be enforced, America's smog-filled skies began to clear for the first time in many decades. Nixon's first year in office, 1969, had witnessed two major environmental disasters, the Santa Barbara oil spill in California and the Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio. As more and more Americans began to exhibit concern for the future of the nation's water, air, and land resources, Nixon responded in July 1970 with an executive order creating the Environmental Protection Agency. So no president since Theodore Roosevelt had done as much for the country's environment as Dick Nixon. Yet most people agree with historian Bill Brands that Nixon's environmentalism, for all its importance, was tactical rather than philosophical. If the president had read Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring, the book widely credited with awakening Americans to the degradation of their environment, he showed no sign of having been moved by its message. At one point, Nixon said, "In a flat choice between smoke and jobs, we're for jobs." Nixon's record on race was similar. As with the environment, Nixon was at best a grudging liberal. Yet it was under Nixon that real integration of public schools in the South finally took place. Nixon was also the first president to push affirmative action hiring policies to help both African Americans and women get jobs. In the same general area of workers' rights, Nixon sponsored the establishment of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that small government conservatives came to hate as much as they hated affirmative action and the EPA. And Nixon's approach to welfare was, if anything, more radical than Lyndon Johnson's. In 1969, Nixon proposed a federal guaranteed income. This proved too radical for Congress, although expansion of the food stamp program and automatic cost of living adjustments to Social Security recipients achieved somewhat the same effect. To a large degree, as Bill Brand says, Nixon supported progressive causes to get the liberals off his back and let him focus on the issues that really mattered to him, most of which concerned foreign policy. And Nixon had big plans for a complete recasting of American foreign policy based on a growing realization that the world's two major communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, hated each other more than they hated the United States. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger gave reporters the slip by faking a stomach ache while on a trip to Pakistan. The next day, Kissinger shocked the world by turning up in Beijing, China, after a secret flight over the Himalayas. Kissinger's mission was to lay the groundwork for Nixon's own visit to China the next year. In February 1972, Richard Nixon, who had begun his rise in Republican political circles by denouncing liberal Democrats for losing China to the communists, met with Chinese leaders Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and thus opened a new era in international relations. Just a couple of months later, in May of 1972, Nixon traveled to Moscow and met with the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, who had been alarmed by Nixon's overtures to China. This was exactly what Nixon expected, and he and Brezhnev announced that they were beginning an era of détente. As part of this new era of peaceful coexistence, the two leaders signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. But for all the good Nixon may have accomplished, his presidency will mainly be remembered for the bad and the ugly. The extreme measures he took to defend his Vietnam policy against enemies, both real and imagined, led directly to the Watergate scandals that would eventually force his resignation. Specifically, the term Watergate referred to the incident in which a team of burglars was caught red-handed breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington during the 1972 presidential campaign. During a series of revelations that came out in court trials and televised Senate hearings, no evidence was ever revealed that Nixon himself had ordered the break-in. But from the start, he was personally involved in covering up the incident and attempting to block the investigation. Moreover, the Watergate investigation revealed that Nixon had been involved in a series of illegal activities directed against the press and other critics of his Vietnam policy. Nixon's presidency unraveled amidst a series of revelations in 1973 and 1974. The most damaging came from Nixon's former legal counsel, John Dean, who told the Senate Investigating Committee that Nixon had approved a cover-up of the Watergate burglary. Then White House aide Alexander Butterfield told the committee that Nixon had recorded most of his conversations in the Oval Office, including many concerning Watergate. This revelation began a year-long battle for control of the Nixon tapes. Finally, on July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. He did so, but part of the recordings were missing, including an 18-and-a-half-minute gap in a key conversation during which Nixon first mentioned the Watergate break-in. A few days later, the House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend 3 articles of impeachment. Before the entire House could vote on impeachment, Nixon turned over the rest of the tapes. Knowing that these tapes would implicate him in the cover-up, Nixon resigned from office on August 9, 1974, and was succeeded as president by Gerald R. Ford. After taking the oath of office from Chief Justice Warren Burger, Ford, who had been appointed vice president after the resignation of Nixon's first VP, Spiro Agnew, said, "Our long national nightmare is over." Perhaps the Watergate nightmare was over, but for many Americans, the rest of the 1970s would seem like a nightmare, or at least a bizarre dream. It was a tough decade, and as an unelected president, Jerry Ford got a lot of the blame. By all accounts, Ford was a nice man who understood his own limitations. "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln," he said modestly. But even a Lincoln would have been challenged by the problems of a country mired in hard economic times and profoundly disillusioned by the turmoil of the previous decade.